Good afternoon, everybody. I am Caoilfhionn van der Walt. I am sitting here in Mauritius today. I'm the founder of Regan van Rooy. We're a boutique tax advisory firm focused on Africa. And our special guest is Candice Thompson, also sitting in Mauritius. So Candice is a friend of mine and also a fellow woman entrepreneur and a fellow expat in Mauritius. We're actually sitting back to back in the same office at the moment. So Candice, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for joining our session today.
Thank you so much for having me, Caoilfhionn. It's great to be here and just answer some people's questions, clear up some info. I know there's always a lot of people with so many questions about Mauritius. How can they move here? What can they do? How can they get here? What are the permit options? But there's also a lot of incorrect information out there. So I'm always happy to explain the options and hopefully clear up any confusion that people may be having.
Fantastic. So guys, if I could ask you to put in the chat where you're dialing in from. We're assuming most of you are in South Africa, but it'll be great to know where you are. And as we go through our presentation today, please ask any questions you have in the chat. We'll keep them confidential, but it's a great opportunity to ask us on anything that's unclear as we go, or ask us about anything specific relevant to you. You might have specific questions about Mauritius. And Candice, before we start, will you give us a bit of an intro on CoralBridge and tell us what you do and how you help people interested in moving to Mauritius?
Sure. So as you can hear, I think a lot of you, it looks like a lot of you are from South Africa. So I am originally from South Africa. I come from Joburg, but I've lived in Mauritius now for about 19 years. So a very long time, but never lose that strong South African accent, I don't think. So my company is literally just an immigration consultancy company. So we assist people who are looking for help with their permits. You know, for a lot of people, they like to try and do the permit applications themselves, which is not always a bad option. But when you are moving your dogs and your children and your family overseas and you're selling up everything, there's a lot of stress. There's a lot of moving parts. So just having somebody who can kind of guide you and hold your hand through the permit application process is a huge benefit that allows you to then concentrate on all the other things you need to do, and you know that that's at least sorted. So that's essentially what I do. I've got permit application packages, or CoralBridge has got permit application packages that assist with all the various aspects, obviously the permit application itself, but also extra services like helping you with a personal bank account opening if you require it, you know, assisting with medical bookings and all of those, and answering a myriad of questions. We get loads of questions, as I'm sure you can imagine, from different people along different things. So I kind of answer people's questions. And because I've lived here for such a long time, I've also got quite a good list of service providers that I can refer people to.
Great. I wish I had somebody like you when we moved to Mauritius. So Candice, what brought you to Mauritius originally? I didn't realize you've been here 19 years.
So I think, full disclosure, it's been 19 years with one break back in South Africa. My husband and I ended up going back to South Africa in 2010. So I did spend sort of that 1 year back, but I kind of don't count it anymore because it's so small in comparison. My husband's actually a pilot. So initially I moved here with him and spent many years on a dependent permit before I sort of stepped out into the corporate space. So it's been wonderful to have that experience. I can speak to a lot of spouses here are on dependent permits. So I understand the frustrations that go along with that and the difficulties sometimes, especially if you're moving from a corporate space into just being on a dependent permit. Sometimes that can be quite a hard transition. So that's, roughly followed him. And now I'm sort of blazing my own trail.
Great. Well, I've been here 6 years, so I'm a mere baby compared to you, but still, I must say, I did find the move quite challenging. I'm Irish, had lived a long time in London and a long time in South Africa, so was quite blasé about the move. But I think it is quite a, it's quite a different environment to South Africa, and it is good to have some assistance with the transition. So Candice, can you start by telling us kind of in a nutshell why Mauritius is a good place for people to move to?
Would you like me to share my
Yes,
presentation? Yeah,
great.
because I've got some points with that. So I've got a slide with that. So hopefully everyone can see that. Okay, so there's quite a lot on here, but essentially, and I just want to move you up, Keelan, because you are in the middle of my slide. Obviously, everybody thinks of Mauritius, they think of blue water, they think of palm trees and beaches and lots of hikes, but there's so much more to Mauritius, and it really has positioned itself as one of the top tier countries in Africa. It is part of Africa, for those of you who are not aware of that. And it has sort of positioned itself in many ways as a corporate hub, as a business hub. So for many people, that's the biggest, I think, pull for Mauritius, is that it's a favorable tax jurisdiction, that it's very easy to do business from Mauritius. We have a lot of people remote working from here. We've got reliable internet connectivity. If you're working, say, for companies in South Africa, you've got a very convenient time zone of only 2 hours, which works quite well for a lot of people. And then on top of that, it's classified as the safest country in Africa. This is 2025 rating, as well as the most developed nation in Africa, also the 2025 rating. So there are a lot of benefits to Mauritius. It is obviously a very small island. It's roughly about 40 kilometers wide by about 60 kilometers long, so quite small. If you're used to a big bustling city, that takes a little bit of getting used to, but I think largely the pros definitely outweigh any cons that there are.
Makes sense. And certainly we'll talk a bit about the tax as we go through, but I'm sure everyone knows that Mauritius is, we can no longer say a tax haven, but a tax favorable jurisdiction.
Yes.
And certainly for businesses, the highest tax rate is 15%. For individuals, the highest tax rate is 20%. But key benefits are there's no inheritance tax, no donations tax, and no capital gains tax. So they're quite nice sweeteners from the tax perspective.
Definitely. And I think also just obviously looking at people who are looking to actually move here. Many people set up businesses and never move to Mauritius, and they just use it for those tax benefits. But for those who are looking to relocate, and obviously that is what this webinar is about, there are a lot of really good pros. If you compare it to many other countries where it takes well over a year to relocate, Mauritius is much quicker than that. You're looking at, for most, the sort of from beginning to end, you're looking at probably about 3 months for the permit application process. You don't need things like apostille documents, although being somebody in the immigration field, it's something I do recommend people get because it's a useful document to have. And relatively affordable on the application fee side, especially compared to countries like Australia, Canada, where the fees can be quite high. So those are sort of, I'd say, the ease of relocation is probably one of your biggest pros.
Great. And then can you take us through the main permit options that are open to people? And I see from all our attendees who've put in their location, everyone so far is in South Africa. So okay, we're speaking to a South African Mauritius transition then.
Okay, super. So I'll start with your occupation permits first, because I find there's a lot of misinformation around occupation permits. Essentially, there are 3 types of occupation permits in Mauritius. You've got your investor permit, you've got your self-employed permit, and your professional permit. Now, what an occupation permit does is it allows you to both live and work in Mauritius. And this is very, very crucial, because a lot of people come and they will jump onto a permit and they don't realize until they get here that the permit that they're on doesn't actually allow them to legally work in Mauritius. Obviously, when I'm talking about working in Mauritius, I'm talking about working locally in Mauritius. There are obviously many, many people who are working for foreign operators abroad, and that's a different thing. But I'm talking specifically about working in Mauritius for a Mauritian-based company, or as a self-employed individual. So I'll go through each one. And please, Keelan, if anybody does have any questions, feel free to stop me, because I think it's easier to answer questions as we go than try and refer back to the various permits that might be trickier.
Yeah, guys, I'll add to that. I'll keep an eye on the chat. So as we go through, if you've any questions on what we're covering, if anything is unclear, if you'd like any information on any of the points, please just put it in the chat and then we can address it in real time.
Okay, perfect. So the first one I'll start with is the investor permit. Now, your investor permit is probably your top tier occupational permit because you don't have really very many restrictions on it. You can be the director of the company. You can be the 100% shareholder of the company that you invest in if you want to, obviously. And it is a 10-year permit, which is renewable. It can be linked to either a global business license company, that's what the GBL in the slide stands for, or a domestic company in Mauritius. And you need to invest 50,000, hence the term investor. You need to invest 50,000 US dollars into the company's bank account. Now, this can be a new company. It doesn't have to be an existing company. Many people set their company up for the purpose of obviously doing business, but also the purpose of getting that investor permit. And then once that money's in your company bank account, that is up to you and the company to use as you like. So for many people, they will put that 50,000 in and they will use it to maybe buy stock for their company, or they may use it to buy a company car, or they may just leave it there as free capital. It's really up to you. There's no restriction on what you do with that 50,000 once it is in the company's bank account.
And Candice, I think that's an important point. So if anyone on the call has set up a company in, for instance, Ghana or other African countries that have got a capitalization requirement, often there are very tight restrictions on what you have to do with those funds. And often they have to be converted to local currency, which is can be a real cost. But there's absolutely no restriction on what you can do with that 50,000 investment. Is that right?
Yeah, no restriction.
Right.
Really what they want to see in the way of the permit application is they want to see that money coming from overseas, from your personal bank account, because you are the investor that is applying, into the company's bank account. And then obviously you'll see on the slide, there's that annual turnover of 4 million rupees, and that comes in from year 3. So especially for new companies, I think they only actually added in, it used to be obviously from the beginning, and they realized that for many companies from the beginning, it's very hard to achieve a 4 million rupee, Mauritian rupee turnover. So they've given a bit of a grace period, which is great.
And that's about, Candice, what is that, about 1.5 million rand?
What the 4 million
4 million rupees, yeah.
Yeah, it's about 2. Yeah, it is probably about
Okay.
1.5 million rand, roughly. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't actually work that out. Not lately.
Yeah, we always think in rupees and dollars and rand at the same time, but I guess most people on the call are thinking in rand.
Okay. And then I haven't gone over all the requirements there, but just some of the big ones are obviously your company corporation documents, your registers. They do like to see a detailed business plan and forecast financials for 5 years. They want to they want to see that it looks like your company is going to be able to make that turnover requirement.
Yes.
So that's
and Candice, this is actually the permit I came to Mauritius on. And when I applied in late 2018, then it was only a 3-year permit, but renewable. And it also required an investment of $100,000. And I remember being quite skeptical about this $100,000, you know, what's going to happen when I put it in. But I used it for rent, you know, for salaries. There was complete flexibility about it. And I think it took us probably 6 weeks from start to finish to set up the business and do the business plans and all of that. And then the actual permit took some time after that, but it was very quick and efficient.
Yeah, it really is. I think and what they've done now, which is great, is many people were struggling with because of compliance levels, opening company bank accounts can take some time. And then because you're working with quite small timelines with approvals and things, that was getting in the way. So what they've even done now is they've actually given you 2 months after your permit is finalized to actually put that money into, you've got 2 months, 60 days after your permit's finalized to actually invest that 50,000. In order to just work within banks' timelines and things as well, and where there is obviously a delay with opening company bank accounts. So,
great. And maybe I'll just add a bit about the company type. So a GBL is generally a company that is set up if you're going to be trading outside of Mauritius. And in GBL, the headline tax rate is 15%, but there's many different exemptions and beneficial tax regimes that can apply to, and a common use of a GBL is as an international trading company, and that's got a 3% tax rate. A domestic company is a company that's used for trading within Mauritius. And generally, you can be a domestic company even with international shareholders or non-Mauritian citizen shareholders, provided at least half of your customer base are Mauritian. And the headline tax rate there is 15% with an extra 2% corporate social responsibility levy, just to get an idea of the applicable rates. And Candice, I see we have our first question. Thank you, Ashwin. So the question is, what if the company could not achieve turnover criteria in year 3? Would the permit be revoked? Candice and I were actually chatting about this earlier.
So essentially in all the documentation, it actually is, they only actually supposedly look at that turnover requirement upon renewal, which is in 10 years. Now, the reason I can't answer this with 100% certainty is because they actually only, like you said, Caoilfhionn, these were 3-year permits, and they only changed them to 10-year permits in round about 2020. And at that stage, everybody that was on a 3-year permit automatically got an extra 7 years. So nobody's actually hit that 10-year mark yet. They're coming up soon, but nobody's actually hit that 10-year mark. But essentially, my understanding is that they will look at that 4 million rupees from when it comes to renewing in 10 years. And unfortunately, it is written into the Immigration Act. It is a requirement. So if you haven't made the 4 million rupees per year, or at least an aggregate of 4 million rupees per year, then they unfortunately won't renew your permit. However, I don't see them cancelling it because yeah, it's literally just states that it's a renewal criteria. But unfortunately, nobody has actually been able to answer. And I don't know of anybody who's had their permits cancelled. But it is important to run your numbers.
So I think it's important to know that is the rule, and upon renewal, it might not be renewed if you haven't met the criteria. But in practice, neither of us have ever seen anyone's permit being revoked because they haven't met those thresholds.
Yes. And I think I always say to clients, you know your business the best. So when it comes to Mauritius and setting up here, whether it's a GBL or, generally a GBL, you will make the 4 million. But for domestic companies especially, it can be tricky because you're bringing a company that maybe, or a business that is maybe very successful in South Africa to a very different market, to a small island, and you can't just do a copy paste. Yeah. So it is important to just run the numbers and look and say, okay, will my business, is 4 million rupees actually viable? And just kind of try and be quite conservative when you're working that out, because you don't want, you can change permits if you want to, but you don't want to have spent all that money and come here and then you find you can't make it.
And that probably brings us quite nicely onto the next permit. So if you really are a one-man show with small turnover, the self-employed permit might be a better option.
Yeah, so the self-employed permit, essentially, again, it's a 10-year permit that's renewable. The self-employed permit is very much for the services sector only. And I think this is good because it's often the services sector where you cannot make that 4 million. If you've got a company that's selling a boat, you sell 2 boats a year and you've basically made your turnover requirement. But when it's services and it's time-based, that's where it's quite tricky. And that's why the self-employed is a really good option for people in the services sectors, whether it's, I've done numerous self-employeds from a myriad of different consultants, IT specialists, to people like life coaches, web designers, graphic designers, all sorts. So really anybody that's in the services sector. And it's in an essence, it's very similar to a sole proprietorship in South Africa. You've got a one-person business and you're working under your own name. So you don't have a company that you've incorporated. You will get a business registration card, but it is an individual business registration card that's linked to you as an individual. And then, Caoilfhionn, I know you can go more into the tax, but basically when it comes to tax, you are filing as a person, as an individual when it comes to filing your tax. There is again a minimum investment for the self-employed permit of $35,000 US. I think that's just under I think it's just it's the 50,000. That's just under R1,000,000. 35 is about 650 to 700,000 rand. I think if I'm sort of closely correct. And that money will come from overseas into your personal bank account, because remember, for this permit, you're not actually setting up a company. So it goes into your personal bank account. Again, there's no restriction on that money. So when you bring it in, you can keep it in US dollars, you can change it to Mauritian rupees, and that is up to you to use as you'd like. So many people will use it to purchase a car or to pay for their deposit, partially their deposit on their rental house, etc. And then again, there's also an annual turnover requirement, but much more doable, 800,000 Mauritian rupees per year, which works out to about 66,000 rupees a month, which I think for most people is achievable.
Yeah. And Candice, on this, so obviously Mauritius is selling itself as a tax-friendly jurisdiction, trying to welcome essentially wealthy people in so that it can benefit from those expats. But where do you see issues here? Like, are there, because Mauritius obviously also has to protect its own local population and local jobs. So are there self-employed permits that you see being refused? And if so, are there specific industries or types of service that that seem to be trickier to get through?
Definitely, Keelan. So there unfortunately isn't a list, which would probably make our lives a lot easier. But anything, I think, with all of the permits, really anything in sort of the tourism sector is quite carefully looked at, and often doesn't go through, because the tourism sector is very much kept for Mauritians, and rightly so. Self-employed, the one thing that they don't allow, and it's very specific, is anything where you need to be registered with the Allied Professional Health Council. So that's physiotherapists, yes, occupational therapists, psychologists, anybody that needs to be registered with AHPC, you aren't permitted to go self-employed. Then you have to set up a company and go that route. Also, they're not really big on people in the sort of beauty sector. So, hairdressers, spa services, all of those kind of things. Generally, you won't get an approval on a self-employed for that. But like I said, most things, especially when it's professional consulting type services, those work really well. And like I said, I've done quite a few life coaches as well. One of the biggest benefits, I think, for the self-employed permit is that you're not limited as to where your client base is. So you can have clients in Mauritius, you can have clients outside of Mauritius, you can have a mix, all of one, all of the other. There's absolutely no limitations. So that's what's really nice. And you can obviously bill in whatever currency you want to. So if you have a lot of clients, say in the US, you can bill in US dollars, you can bill in GBP, obviously you can bill in Mauritian rupees, so that there's no limitation on that either.
Great, and maybe that's a good point to come in on the tax. So the tax for individuals is fairly straightforward. You'll be taxed on everything you earn when you're resident in Mauritius, whether your clients are South African or the US or Mauritian. And the highest tax rate is 20%. So there's a sliding scale from about 2% up to 20%. And the effective tax rate, the average effective tax rate is about 12%. And there is a tax-free allowance of about 400,000 rupees. But it's quite a straightforward tax regime, with the maximum rate being 20%, obviously less than half the maximum rate in South Africa.
Yes, thanks, Keelan. That's great. I think that's what makes it really, really popular for a lot of people who are sitting. And for a lot of these people doing services, it's remote work. Majority of the time, I would say it's remote work. So you really can sit in Mauritius and do it, as opposed to sitting in South Africa and then benefit from that lower tax rate.
Yeah.
Again, for the requirements, I haven't gone into all of them. I will say, though, that of all the permit applications, this is the most document heavy one. And probably your biggest document that you need to work on is your business plan. It needs to be detailed. And they again want 5 years of forecast financials that are broken up quarterly. So it is quite a that's quite a big one, and that is what I do a lot of the time with my self-employed clients. Is we really go through that business plan with a fine-tooth comb and make sure that that I feel it's ticking the boxes and will have a good chance of being approved by the committee. Just on that very quickly, and I didn't do a slide on it, but just for all of these permits, while I'm mentioning the committee, each and every permit is obviously looked at on a case-by-case basis. We've got a joint committee in Mauritius that's made up of the Prime Minister's Office, the Passport and Immigration Office, and the Economic Development Board, who are sort of the jurisdiction that kind of runs the permit applications. But every permit, including retirement permits, etc., you name it, are all looked at on an individual basis. So really, it's not just sort of a bulk ticking of boxes. They consider each one individually. Okay, should I go to the next one?
Yes, the next one, let's look at the more for employed people. So we've looked at business owners and then kind of one-man shows, self-employed. Let's look at more professional permit.
So your professional permit is probably it's the permit that most people are on in Mauritius, and in general, it is the permit that you'll be on if you are employed with a company. Now, this is specifically for skilled labor. Obviously, when it comes to unskilled labor, like construction workers, people working in the textile industry, things like that, those will not go on a professional permit. Those people will go under what we call a work permit, which is very different. And I find there's a lot of people tend to often use the incorrect terminology. And I have to first, when they ask me for help with a permit, they say, can you help me with our work permit? And then I have to first try and pinpoint what permit they're actually on so that I can give them the right advice. That's interesting.
I didn't know they were, because I call it a work permit rather than a professional permit. Okay, I didn't realize it was a different permit for those kind of more manual labor.
Yeah, so the unskilled will go through the Ministry of Labour, whereas the professional permit will go through with all of these other investment permits.
Okay.
It's again up to 10 years, but the permit duration is really based on your contract of employment. So with these permits, it is linked, and it's something that's also very important to understand, is it's linked to the employer that is doing the application. Generally, your employer will do the application on your behalf or sort of go side by side with you to assist you with it. And it is not transferable. So if you decide you don't like working for the employer that has applied for your permit and you want to change jobs, that means a cancellation of the permit and a whole new application with your new employer. So probably the biggest document for this permit application is your detailed contract of employment and job description. And they will look at two things. They're going to look at, number one, that you are qualified to do what it is that the company wants to hire you to do. So they do look at your qualifications. And secondly, they're going to look at your experience. So they want to know that you have experience to fulfill the role that you are employed to do. And they have lowered the minimum monthly basic salary to a very low amount. It's probably just under 10,000 Rand per month that they've lowered to. And that is the minimum monthly basic salary. It started many years ago when I first moved here. I think it was on about 100,000 rupees a month. And it's consistently dropped down. And it's now 22,500 rupees per month. Now, obviously, that is your basic salary. So if you're earning commissions, if you're earning all these other things that can be over and above that, this is just your basic salary. So what they have done by having a basic salary means that you can't be on a commission only basis. You have to have at least a small monthly basic salary in order to apply for this permit.
Yeah, but this permit has opened up a lot with the reduction in the required salary, and I think it's generally fairly easy to get, provided all the correct information is given. And again, the Mauritius government is, of course, trying to make sure foreigners don't come in and compete with the local job market. But if it can be proven that the person is going to fulfill a specific role in Mauritius, it's generally quite a straightforward permit, from my understanding.
Yes, definitely. I think most of the documentation really comes from the employer, other than obviously your qualifications, your CV, and your personal documents. So most of the documentation will come from the employer. And what they've also done, which I haven't put on here, but it's just important to notice, they've now allowed for something called a self-undertaking. So if you are made redundant or you decide to leave your job and you haven't quite found another job, you can sign a 6-month self-undertaking with the EDB, which allows you 6 months to stay in Mauritius without having to leave and find another job, or maybe switch to a self-employed permit or set up a company or whatever, which is something that they never used to do.
That's great. Yes, you have a
really
bit of a
nice.
grace period.
Exactly. Yeah,
oh, that's a good idea. We do have a question, Candice, but it's on the retirement permit, so maybe we can discuss it on the next slide. But the question is that Irene has just received a retired citizen permit and just has to pick it up in Mauritius. She wants to know, can I be allowed to invest in an B&B business, and is there any guidance provided? I don't know if you want to answer that now or go through the retirement permit first.
Let me go into the retirement permit so that everybody kind of knows what we're talking about, and then I will answer that question.
Great. And guys, please do come in with other questions. This is your way to get free advice from our top immigration expert in Mauritius.
Thanks, Keelan. Okay, so the retirement permit is available to those over 50 years old.
Which is quite young.
Very
young. Quite shocked to find out my husband was able to get the retirement visa. So it is, often people think a retiree visa will only apply after 65, but I mean, 50 is very young.
Yeah, very young. I know many people who are on retirement permits and they've got like 3-4-year-old children that are running around, you know. It just seems a bit strange. But yes, so over 50 years old, and obviously just the main applicant needs to be over 50 years old. So if you're the main applicant and your spouse, if they're 40, that's also fine. You can still apply for the retirement permit and your spouse as a dependent. And it is 10 years. So again, renewable. What's really nice is that it's quite affordable for, I think, for most people. So there's a minimum of $1,500 US, which is roughly, I think, about 25 to 26,000 Rand per month, I think, roughly, that you need to bring into Mauritius. Now, that money, again, it's not locked. That money you can use for your living expenses. And what's really good is rather that they allow you to bring it in per annum. You can bring it in once a year, twice a year, 3 times a year, or you can bring it in monthly. And the reason that they've allowed that is because there are people who are earning income monthly, whether it's pension income, rental income, etc., that you can then, rather than bringing in a lump sum, can bring that in monthly. And I think I have a lot of retirees that come in. I do these permits a lot. I think most of the time people do tend to actually bring in more than 1,500 because, unfortunately, like the rest of the world, the cost of living has sort of gone up everywhere. So depending on your your lifestyle and the way you live, you probably find you would need to bring in more than 1,500, unless you really live quite simply and you're on your own, and depending on the area you live in.
And Candice, if you're on a retirement permit, are you allowed work as well?
Unfortunately not. So the retirement permit, that's a good question, Keelan. Sorry, I should have started with that. Unfortunately not. The retirement permit is not one of the occupational permits that we spoke about before. The retirement permit is a residence permit. So it allows you to live in Mauritius but not work locally in Mauritius. That being said, there are a lot of retirees here who are working online, whether it's trading, whether it's earning rental income, but it is very much, there is a limitation on that. And I think just going into the question that I think it was Irene asked earlier. So when it comes to Mauritius, you are allowed to invest in the way of shareholding. So you may own shares in businesses when you're on a retirement permit. However, you may not earn income. So dividends are not taxable. And I think the EDB doesn't really count dividends as earnings. So you may earn, obviously, dividends and own shares in something. But when it comes to actually working and earning a salary or a director's fee or anything like that, then they will obviously frown upon that. So I hope, Irene, that answers your question.
So what I've understood for Irene is, yes, she's definitely going to be allowed to invest in a B&B business, but she wouldn't be allowed to work in it or receive a salary, but she can earn profits from the B&B business.
Yes.
Cool. And Candice, can we go back to the point about dependence you raised? So when we're talking about these permits, can you talk about how the person's spouse and children and potentially parents, whether they would be covered by anything linked to those permits?
So thanks, Kitty. And again, I don't have a slide for that. My apologies. But yes, so dependents, on all of these permits, you may bring your dependents. So your dependents are obviously your spouse. They also allow common law spouse. So if you're not legally married, that you have an affidavit of cohabitation, that's also allowed. And you can bring your children, whether it's stepchildren, adopted children, you just need the relevant documentation in each case, obviously biological children. And what they have done is they've done away with any, I know they used to, so a lot of people say, okay, but my child's over the age of 24, but they're still studying. So they've done away with the maximum age limit on your dependent children. If your children are maybe have failure to launch and are still living at home at the age of 26 and are studying, maybe you can still bring them on as your dependents. That's not a problem at all. And then obviously you can also bring your parents, and this is the main applicant's parents. So if you are the main applicant on, for example, a retirement permit, you may bring your parents. You can't bring your wife. You can't bring your in-laws, exactly. So your wife or your husband would need to be the main applicant. So that's also where I advise my clients, and I'll say, okay, well, which one of you actually wants to bring your parents? Because it makes more sense for that person to be the main applicant.
Okay.
Something just quickly on dependents. Again, dependents will receive a residence permit, the same as the retirement permit. So it's a residence permit. It doesn't allow you to work in Mauritius. So your children may stay on you as dependents as long as they are wholly dependent on you and unmarried and obviously not earning.
Okay, that makes sense. And we've got a couple of questions now on the tax around the retirement permit. So let me cover that. So first of all, when you become tax resident in Mauritius, depends on two things. Firstly, there's the Mauritius rules, and then there's the South African rules as to when you cease to become resident in South Africa. And in that situation, the double taxation agreement between South Africa and Mauritius comes into play. But essentially, in Mauritius, the tax year runs from 1 July to 30 June. And if in any tax year you're in Mauritius for more than 183 days, you're tax resident for that whole year. So let's say someone moves to Mauritius on the 1st of January 2025, they will then be in Mauritius for more than 183 days up until 30 June. So they will be resident from 1 July 2024. The other rule is if you are in Mauritius for more than 273 days across 3 tax years, you become tax resident. But it's fairly easy to trigger tax residence in Mauritius by spending more than 6 months here. An important issue is whether you are regarded as non-resident in South Africa, because it can be that South Africa still thinks you're resident there and Mauritius thinks you're resident here. So that's something that's important to work out. And in Mauritius, in South Africa, there is a requirement to formally emigrate from a tax perspective, which can lead to an exit charge, which is a deemed capital gain on all of your assets at the date of emigration. So it's something that can be quite complex and needs to be looked at clearly. It needs to be looked at carefully, and we can help with any questions you have on that. But in terms of how retirees are taxed, so first of all, in terms of the $18,000 that they have to bring into Mauritius every year, that is not taxed, provided it is not coming in as a remittance or a salary payment. So where you can demonstrate that's coming in, let's say from a savings account, that is not taxed in Mauritius. And your pension, any foreign pension, will also not be taxed in Mauritius. Now, it won't be taxed if it's coming from South Africa, because there is a double taxation agreement between South Africa and Mauritius that provides that any pension that is related to work you've done in South Africa can only be taxed by South Africa, and it cannot be taxed by Mauritius. Otherwise, if you're coming from a country which doesn't have a double taxation agreement with Mauritius, it will still not be taxed in Mauritius, provided you basically pay it in via a savings account. So that's something that if you're not receiving a pension from South Africa, you might need to look at to make sure it's not regarded as remitted in Mauritius. But the simple answer is foreign pension will not be taxable in Mauritius, provided you're careful. I hope that makes sense. If you have any more questions on that, let us know. And I'm going to look at the questions raised here. So
sorry,
for retirees,
can
for
I
their
just
pension,
ask quickly?
yeah.
What is your do you think it's a requirement for retirees in Mauritius to register with the MRA and do, even if it's a null filing every year?
Yes, yeah. So once you trigger residence in Mauritius, you should register with the Mauritian Revenue and file your tax return. And you trigger residence essentially once you've been in Mauritius for more than 6 months. But generally, if you're not going to get in big trouble for not filing a tax return if there's no tax due. We recommend it's done to be clear, but the real risk is to make sure you've tax emigrated from South Africa, if that is your intention, and don't just assume that by living in another country and even registering for tax in another country, don't just assume that that means you're no longer resident in South Africa. That's where the risks can arise. Cool. So some of the questions here, whether pension received from foreign jurisdictions is taxable in Mauritius. So the simple answer is no, it is not. There can be a bit more complexity, but in general, if it's related to work you've done in South Africa has taxing rights, whether or not you're resident in Mauritius or resident in South Africa, and Mauritius won't tax, but you have to be careful to ensure that it could not be regarded as remitted here. Another question is, on the retired permit, I want to establish myself as a Mauritian tax resident in terms of the DTA between Mauritius and South Africa and cease tax residence in South Africa. How long would it take to become a Mauritian tax resident? So, as I said, you become a Mauritian tax resident if you're in the country for 183 days in a tax year. So if you were to move here in, let's say, March 2005, you would not be able to, you won't trigger residence in that tax year, which is the tax year ended 30 June. You will only trigger it from 1 July 2025, assuming you are in Mauritius for 6 months in the period from 1 June 2025 to 1 July 2025 to 30 June 2026. So it's not quite as simple as being 6 months in the country, because you have to be 6 months in the tax year. And then again, it's relatively simple to become a tax resident here, but you have to ensure you are no longer regarded as a tax resident in South Africa. And days present in Mauritius will not make that happen. You have to be able to prove that your true home is actually Mauritius rather than South Africa. So that's something that can be quite complicated. I'm very happy to talk to anyone about that offline. We do have a couple of webinars on our YouTube channel, which is specifically on this topic, tax emigrating from South Africa. It is complex, and often for retirees, there can be a very large tax bill on tax emigrating from South Africa because they've built up a lot of assets that can give rise to a high capital gains tax. So sometimes we recommend retirees not to emigrate for tax purposes from South Africa, but to remain tax resident in South Africa, although also being regarded as tax resident in Mauritius, and then applying the double taxation agreement to revert to South Africa, simply because the exit charge would be too high. So sorry, guys, I know this is very complex, but please feel free to email me with any questions about this offline, or look on our YouTube channel or our website for specific articles on tax emigration. We also have one more question. Candice, somebody has asked, this was in relation to Irene's question. Someone was asking, could Irene be a digital nomad on a retired permit? So we were talking about this, about whether you can have 2 permits. And essentially the answer is no, but can you talk through how that might happen if you have a retirement permit, but also want to do work as a digital nomad for an overseas employer?
Yeah, so essentially you wouldn't need to be on the digital nomad, which I'm going to talk about next, permit. in order to, you could stay in Mauritius on the retirement permit. Obviously, like I said, there's a limitation on working locally in Mauritius, but you can work for a foreign operator. So that's essentially what a digital nomad would be. Obviously, Caoilfhionn, and this is where you would come in, on the tax side, I think it can get a little bit tricky because now you're here and there and who knows where. But essentially, that's not going to be something that's not allowed. A lot of people, I think, the money that they bring in, it comes from many different sources. So the EDB, they would like to think that everybody's $1,500 they're bringing in comes from a pension, but obviously we know that that's not realistically possible. People bring in those funds from various different sources, whether it's rental income. I've had clients that still do consulting for their previous employer remotely while they're here on a retirement permit, which is totally fine. There are people with large real estate holdings, and that's really just their income. And then you do have those that have obviously a pension income. You've got those that live off dividends or live off interest or whatever from various investments. So there are many different ways that you can earn that. The EDB is not going to ask you. You do need to, on the anniversary of your permit every year, just send them your bank statements in Mauritius and the SWIFT advice, just to show them that you have been sending that money in every year. But they're not going to ask you really where it comes from, although I do suggest it coming from legal places.
Yeah, and I think this is a good example of why you need to speak to somebody like Candice, because there are a lot of different permits. Now, you cannot be on a retirement permit and on a digital nomad permit. So if you're on a retirement visa and you're working for an overseas person, if you are doing that work from Mauritius, you do have to pay tax in Mauritius on it. And so in that instance, it might be better to first apply for a digital nomad scheme and then convert to a retirement permit. The main thing, and we'll come on to it now with the digital nomad scheme, is it's only valid for a year. So there's pros and cons to each, and that's why it is important to meet with an expert, understand all of the options, and determine which is the best for you. We have one more question, which is actually not really on our topic today. It's about setting up a manufacturing company, a free port zone with a strong R&D part. Yes, that's definitely possible. That is a GBL entity, and there's a specific 3% tax regime that applies for a free port zone company. So absolutely, that's a popular way of doing it. What we're covering today is for individuals moving to Mauritius. So if you were the shareholder of that, then obviously you could either apply for the investor permit, or you could apply for I was going to say work permit, but on that, a professional permit as an employee of that. But Pamela, I'd be happy to discuss that offline.
And then just to add to that, Caoilfhionn, obviously, when it comes to the investor permit, I just spoke about the very basic one where you invest your 50,000, but there are a couple of other ones, like a net asset value one for existing companies. And there is actually something with that high-tech machines and equipment that's got that R&D component. So that's where it's good to just look and see if you fit these specific sectors that needs to go into. So there is an option there. And obviously with these, then there's a lower investment amount that's required.
Yeah, thanks, Candice. And Pamela, it is worth looking at this because there are a number of different incentives, either for free port zones or for different activities. So lots to consider.
Okay, super. I'm just going to go over, before I jump in, just one last thing. I'm going to go over this very quickly. Just another way that you can retire that a lot of people aren't aware of is a senior living residence. So that is when you purchase or you acquire life rights to a property within a senior living scheme. So what's nice about this is that there's no minimum acquisition price. And it is one of the options of retiring. However, it's relatively new, so it has to obviously be an approved project, and there aren't a lot of them yet. So there are a lot in the pipeline, but not a lot of them built yet. So just something I thought I'd mention, the residency through a senior living residence. And then from there, I'm just going to hop into the premium visa, which is what I think a lot of the world call a digital nomad visa. So this has really become quite popular. It was introduced in 2020. At one stage, it was ranked fourth globally, but I think now that a lot of other countries have also added digital nomad visas, unfortunately, it's not quite ranked fourth globally anymore. But it is pretty easy to apply for. It's all online. There's no need for medical tests. There's no need to come to Mauritius to finalize it, although you will obviously eventually come to Mauritius in order to activate it. And what's also really beneficial is that there's no application fee to the government of Mauritius. It is totally free to apply for. What they do look at, though, quite strictly is especially your proof of funds. So it can be quite expensive for those with large families. You need to show that you have access to at least 1,500 US dollars per adult and 500 US dollars per child per month. So, for example, for a family of 4, 2 adults, 2 children, you would need to show that you've got access to 4,000 US dollars per month. And they're going to look at that either as a lump sum, where that covers you for the whole year, or they're going to want to see pay slips or proof of employment and bank statements. So they are quite strict on the funds with this, but if you can tick all their boxes, it's a really great visa that allows you to come to Mauritius. I think for a lot of people, I've had a lot of clients that have made the move without even ever having visited Mauritius, which is, I think, quite scary for a lot of people. So if you can come in on a premium visa as a stepping stone, stay for a year, see if you like it, see if it works for you, does it work for your children? And then from there, it's very easy to switch to a longer term permit while you're in Mauritius on the premium visa. There's no need to leave the country and come back in, obviously, unless your premium visa is expired. But while your premium visa is still active, you can easily switch to a longer term permit if you really do like it. And I think a lot of people tend to do that. They start on a premium visa and then switch.
And I agree, Candice. I think this is a great permit. I come across a lot of people on this permit who've never been to Mauritius before, but read about the permit, applied online, got it. And it's definitely cater. I mean, I think Mauritius' idea behind it is to get well off spending power in Mauritius, but not competing in the local market. So there's a lot of online workers and, people who do websites, digital marketing, stuff like that, who come here for a year. The great benefit from a tax perspective is that they are not subject to any type of Mauritian tax. So whatever they earn, they typically will not be taxed in their home country, because there's generally exemptions if you're doing the work outside of your home country, but also Mauritius doesn't tax it at all. So it's a great way for people to live in a new jurisdiction in a tax efficient way for a year. And I agree, a lot of people tend to do this, then fall in love with Mauritius and convert to either the self-employed or the investor permit.
Yeah, it's become very, very popular. And I think it's just a nice idea, if you are working online, if you're working fully remotely, because there's so many countries that are now offering these sort of digital nomad visas. It's such a nice idea to kind of spend some time, move around a little bit, give your family a bit of an adventure. Unfortunately, that's not an option for me.
It's for young people. Hey?
I like the idea.
Yeah, we can dream, Candice.
And then the last thing I'll talk about very quickly, unless there are any questions about that, but it's pretty straightforward. The last thing I'll talk about is just residence through property acquisition. And I think for many people, that's the only thing they ever hear about. I actually got a message today from somebody who said, I would really like to come to Mauritius, but I don't want to buy a property. Are there any other options? Because the property acquisition, you've got all the real estate, you've got agents, you've got the developments. It's the ones that you tend to see on your Facebook feed in advertising, but it is not the only option, as you've seen. However, for many people who would like to purchase property in Mauritius, either to live in themselves or to rent out as an investment, it's a really good option. It is specifically designed for foreigners. So Mauritius is quite strict, and I think, again, something where there's a lot of misinformation. Mauritius is quite strict when it comes to property ownership for foreigners, and I think they're trying to protect the local property market so that the Mauritian people don't get priced out of the property in their own country. So they've put together certain schemes that are open to foreigners to buy. And if you purchase a property within one of these schemes for a minimum of 375,000 US dollars, you can then apply for residency through property acquisition. The nice thing about this residency is that there's no end date. It lasts as long as you own the property, even if you don't live in it. Many people purchase the property, they have the residency, they don't even live in Mauritius, and they rent it out. So you are able to still rent out those properties. You can purchase more than one. One question I get quite often is, can I buy two cheaper properties that equate to 375 together? Will they get me residency? Unfortunately not. It does need to be a single property for a minimum of 375. But there are lots of different schemes. You've got your PDS scheme, your RES, your IRS. So the RES and your IRS are normally the more expensive ones, Gulf estate villas and things. PDS are like duplexes and smaller homes. You've got your smart city scheme. There are a number of smart cities cropping up all over the island, much more affordable, and they often come with a lot of other benefits. And then you've got your ground plus two, which is essentially apartments in buildings with a ground plus two. The other benefit is that you don't need a separate occupation permit to work in Mauritius if you are on one of these permits. So that's just an extra little plus that they've added in.
Cool. So guys, you can see lots of different permits, lots of different ways you can live and work or live and retire in Mauritius. And we do have a couple of questions before the hour for any questions. I see that Tanya has asked, would her South African medical aid work in Mauritius? I assume the answer is no, Candice.
It's actually, the answer is it depends.
Okay.
Discovery, if you're on Discovery medical aid, it does actually cover you in Mauritius under what they call the Africa evacuation benefit. Many times you will phone Discovery and you'll be told, no, you're not covered, but the reality is actually you are covered in Mauritius. So if you have more information about that, you're welcome to contact me and I will send you the relevant documentation. But Discovery, yes, I understand that Momentum is maybe doing the same thing, but I haven't got any information on that yet, so I'm not sure. So, but Discovery, definitely.
Okay. Tanya says she's on government employee medical scheme.
No, I don't think.
Probably not, no. Jim has asked, is there a double taxation agreement with the UK? Yes. And he's also asked, the property acquisition permit, can part of the total be bonded in Mauritius? I assume, yes, you can get a mortgage in Mauritius.
You can. The only thing I think I told you earlier, Keelan, the caveat here is that there is a limitation on if you are purchasing from the developer. So for resales, it's not a problem. But if you're purchasing from a developer, you have to pay the first 750,000 US dollars out of your pocket. In cash. Banks can only give you a bond or a mortgage over 750,000. That does not include the ground plus two. So if you're buying an apartment in ground plus two, you can absolutely get a mortgage. But for any of the others, PDS, RES, IRS, Smart City Scheme, all of those, unfortunately, you do need to pay that at the first 750,000, and you'll find a lot of the time the property is not even 750,000.
Yep.
So
yeah,
it's unfortunate, but that's the ruling.
Okay, guys, we are coming up to the hour. If there's no more questions, we will be sending out the recording of this session to everyone who's registered and our slides. And on the last slide, Candice and my emails are on there. So please feel free to be in contact with any questions or if there's anything we can help you with. Tanya, G+2 means this ground floor plus 2 levels. It's one of the types of property where you can get a property permit.
Yes, so essentially an apartment.
Okay, great. If there's no more questions, we will wrap up there. Candice, thank you so much. That was a very helpful overview of all of the different permits. And even I, who've been living in Mauritius for 6 years, I've learned a lot about the different permits. And I think it shows that there's no kind of one size fits all permit. It depends on what your situation is, what your plans are, and there's lots of different options with different pros and cons to consider.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Keelan. Thanks for the opportunity. It's been lovely to just share this. And like Keelan said, I'm available. Pop me an email. I do a free 30-minute consultancy call. So if you would like to just chat about your options, then I'm happy to do that. So you're welcome to pop me an email.
Thanks, Candice. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye.
Stephen.